Jordan Wells had never planned to get involved in any neighborhood conflict, much less one that would threaten the foundation of everything he'd spent the last 5 years building. His intentions were simple: buy land, develop it legally, and run a quiet but profitable acoustic technology business just outside the main strip of a growing county in the Pacific Northwest. The property he purchased was a former industrial parcel, remote enough for sound testing, isolated enough to avoid unnecessary interference, but still close enough to city routes to allow freight access. The crown jewel of the purchase was a narrow, half-mile private road that ran between a stretch of pine woods and a newly built residential development. The deed was clean. The right-of-way was exclusive. The land, road included, was his. He had pored over every legal document before buying it. The road was not part of any shared access agreement. No servitudes, no easements, no entanglements with any civic group, no historical claims. It had once been a utility access path for the previous industrial tenant, and when that facility was demolished 15 years earlier, the road was left abandoned, until Jordan bought the parcel, repaved the gravel into asphalt, and installed security lighting along the edges. For months, everything was quiet. He filed all the necessary permits, coordinated with a small construction firm to build his testing compound at the end of the road, and hired electricians to install buried conduit for future infrastructure. The only neighbors visible were the tops of identical roofs peeking above a tall wooden fence that ran parallel to the road's northern edge. It was just before dawn on a cold Monday in late October that Jordan first noticed something was wrong. He had driven to the site early, hoping to inspect the underground drainage system after the weekend's heavy rain. As his headlights swept over the smooth pavement, he saw strange indentations in the asphalt, long, heavy tracks, lined with fresh streaks of mud. It wasn't just tire marks from cars, it was the kind of damage caused by industrial-grade vehicles. He parked and walked the road with a flashlight, his boots crunching on scattered gravel. Further down, where the road narrowed near a shallow culvert, he found fresh debris. A strip of orange construction tape tangled in a bush, and a piece of pink spray-painted wood that clearly didn't belong to any of his materials. By midday, the pattern was undeniable. Jordan reviewed his security footage from the previous week and found what he'd feared. Between 4:45 and 6:10 a.m., a convoy of construction vehicles, dump trucks, concrete mixers, and a flatbed carrying rebar had been using his road to access a temporary construction entrance cut through the back fence of the residential development. The footage clearly showed the trucks turning off from the public street, rolling over his pavement and disappearing through a gate that hadn't been there a week earlier. No permission, no warning, no contact. He made 3 calls. First, to the site foreman whose number was posted on the temporary fencing. No answer, just a voicemail. Second, to the Land Records Office, who confirmed that no permits had been issued for rear access construction via his road. And third, to his attorney. "This isn't just some neighbor walking across your lawn," the attorney said flatly. "They're conducting commercial operations through your private property. That's trespassing. And if they're damaging the road, you've got grounds for a civil claim." Jordan was methodical, but he wasn't passive. The next morning, he arrived early and blocked the road with a row of temporary concrete barriers delivered by a local supplier. He placed clear signs: private property, no access, trespassers will be prosecuted. That afternoon, the convoy never showed, but by the following morning, the barriers were gone. Not moved, not toppled, gone, neatly lifted and relocated somewhere else. The signs had been taken too. On his next visit, Jordan noticed the gate to the development had been reinforced. A new sign was hung on the inside of the fence: "Authorized vehicles only. Community development in progress." The implication was brazen, and Jordan was stunned by the audacity. Someone had decided, without consultation, without legality, without shame, that his road was now part of their construction logistics, as if by simply acting like they had the right, they could claim it. It was a level of quiet, organized encroachment that set off alarms in his mind. It wasn't some teenager cutting across a yard. This was a coordinated commercial operation. He scheduled an in-person meeting with the local land use office. The clerk was polite, but ultimately unhelpful. No, there were no registered access agreements. No, there were no known disputes. But when Jordan pressed about whether a group from the nearby neighborhood had filed for any zoning changes or development expansions, the clerk hesitated. "There was a meeting last month," she said, pulling up a PDF from the county website. A representative from the neighborhood association, Karen Millhouse, filed an intent to collaborate request. It doesn't affect your deed, but it suggests they're trying to adjust infrastructure boundaries. "Adjust?" Jordan asked, voice tightening. "How do you adjust a private road that doesn't belong to you?" The clerk shrugged. "They may be pushing for a right-of-way claim. If they get enough signatures and file a public utility claim, it can get messy, but it would take months. Even then, it wouldn't override a private deed unless the county approved eminent domain, and that hasn't happened." But the message was clear. Someone had begun laying groundwork. Not through force, not through legal notice, but through quiet paperwork and daily occupation. Jordan understood what was happening. Death by 1,000 cuts. Delay, ignore, use, claim. He wasn't going to let that happen. He hired a land use attorney. He scheduled a survey to officially mark his property boundaries and submitted a notice of property infringement to the county. Then, just to be thorough, he had his contractor install new, automated gates at both entrances of the road, complete with cameras, steel bollards, and entry code control. The barriers weren't decorative. They were meant to stop anything heavier than a sedan. Within 48 hours, his inbox exploded. He received a cease and desist letter from the Community Development Oversight Board, a name he hadn't heard before, and one that, after research, turned out to be nothing more than a fabricated title used by the neighborhood association for internal use. The letter accused him of obstructing a municipal improvement pathway and violating public access expectations, as if that phrase had legal standing. It didn't. His lawyer nearly laughed reading it, but the construction trucks didn't stop. They started arriving earlier, some just after 4 a.m., long before he could arrive on site. The new gates were tested. Some drivers tried backing up, others tried turning through the woods. One even broke a segment of roadside lighting trying to circumvent the blockade. Jordan upgraded the gate security again. He wasn't going to escalate physically, but he wasn't going to give up an inch either. Then came the anonymous letter in his mailbox. No return address. Thick paper. Bold font. Only one sentence typed at the center of the page. "You don't own what you think you do." He read it 3 times, and on the 4th he folded it neatly, placed it on his desk, and picked up the phone. It was time to stop reacting. It was time to shut them down, for good. Jordan Wells never expected a simple property boundary to turn into an escalating conflict, but as the days passed after receiving the anonymous letter, it became clear that the situation wasn't going away on its own. He had hoped that his formal complaint to the county, the installation of reinforced gates, and the undeniable evidence of unauthorized usage would at least slow the intrusion, but instead, it seemed to trigger something more deliberate and orchestrated. The next morning, before the sun had risen, a call came from his construction site manager, his voice tense and clipped. The message was short. The gate had been cut open during the night, cleanly, methodically, likely with a portable plasma torch. Nothing was stolen, but the gate's control box had been smashed, wires neatly clipped, and the ground was gouged with fresh tracks from what looked like a full convoy of cement trucks and flatbeds. Not a single one of them belonged to his project. Jordan drove out to the site immediately, arriving before the county sheriff's deputy who responded to his report. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the broken lock housing and the deep grooves left in his newly paved road. When the deputy finally arrived, a young man in his late 20s with tired eyes and a badge that looked too big for his chest, Jordan gave a clear and measured statement. He walked the officer through the damaged gate, the clipped wires, the tire marks, and the timeline, explaining the ongoing trespass, the ignored cease and desist, and the falsified claims from the so-called Oversight Board. The deputy nodded through the entire explanation but didn't write much down. When Jordan finished, the deputy sighed, muttered something about jurisdictional overlap, and handed Jordan a small carbon copy of an incident report that felt more ceremonial than useful. "They'll probably just chalk it up to construction error," the deputy said without making eye contact. "Unless you catch someone in the act, it's hard to pin anything on a specific group." "So someone can torch my gate and drive a fleet of trucks through my property, and the best the law can do is hand me a form?" Jordan asked, his tone flat. "Barely," masking his disgust. The deputy shrugged. "That's civil, not criminal. Unless you want to allege intent to damage, and even then, it'd be tough without video." Jordan's security system had caught most of it. The footage was dark, but usable. But even that seemed to matter little. The video showed unmarked trucks, a group of masked individuals working in silence, moving with the precision of the people who'd done this kind of thing before. Whoever they were, they hadn't panicked, hadn't rushed. They didn't try to conceal the trucks themselves, only their faces and license plates. It wasn't random. It was tactical. He sent the footage to his lawyer, who filed an emergency injunction with the local court, demanding immediate recognition of Jordan's sole access rights to the road. While that motion was pending, Jordan didn't wait. He called in his private security contractor, not just a gate installer but a full-service firm that provided site protection for high-risk infrastructure projects. Within 24 hours, they had installed motion-triggered floodlights, seismic sensors, a high-gain directional camera at the bend of the road, and a set of retractable bollards rated for heavy vehicle stoppage. This was no longer about making a point. It was about establishing control. That control was tested the very next night. It was just after 3 a.m. when the seismic sensor tripped. Jordan, sleeping lightly with his phone on the nightstand, received the alert and opened the live feed. A convoy of 4 trucks was rolling slowly toward the gate, their headlights dimmed. As the lead vehicle approached the lowered bollards, it paused, reversed slightly, then tried to push forward again. The sensor lights triggered. White beams blasted across the trees, and for a moment the camera caught the startled face of the driver. The trucks reversed hastily, their tires spinning on the gravel before disappearing back toward the neighborhood access point. Jordan forwarded the footage to the sheriff's office, but he already knew the answer. "We'll log it," came the reply. "But unless they actually break something next time." He didn't wait for next time. The following morning, he showed up at the office of the neighborhood development's property manager, a corporate complex with a name that sounded like it had been generated by AI, Horizon Residential Coordination. He didn't make an appointment. He walked through the lobby, past the decorative succulents and motivational wall posters, and demanded a meeting with whoever was responsible for the site project on the south perimeter of their development. After a long wait and several uncomfortable exchanges with the front desk assistant, he was ushered into a sleek, glass-walled office. Behind the desk sat a woman in her late 50s, immaculately dressed in beige and navy, with manicured nails and a thin smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her nameplate read, Karen Millhouse, Director of Community Infrastructure. She stood when he entered, extending a hand that Jordan didn't shake. "I believe I know why you're here," she said pleasantly, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Let's talk about the road." "There's nothing to talk about," Jordan said. "It's mine. You've been using it illegally. You've damaged private property, interfered with my business, and put heavy equipment on my land without permission. That ends now." Karen's smile didn't falter. "I understand your frustration. But that road service is more than just your compound now. It's become a vital link for the ongoing construction of Phase 3 of our residential build-out. The Planning Committee filed an infrastructure request weeks ago." "Which doesn't change ownership," Jordan said. Intent to request isn't the same as access. You didn't ask. You trespassed. You broke through a secured gate. Karen folded her hands. We're trying to avoid litigation. Surely we can find a cooperative solution. Your road, as you keep calling it, happens to be the most efficient route for a project that will house over 100 families. I think we can agree that blocking it entirely is a bit disproportionate. This isn't a negotiation, Jordan replied. The only thing disproportionate is your belief that you can take something because it's convenient. Karen leaned back slightly as if examining him through a new lens. Her voice dropped, her tone shifting subtly. You should understand what you're involving yourself in, Mr. Wells. This project isn't just a neighborhood facelift. It's backed by county revitalization funds. There are developers, investors, board members involved, people who know how to play this game. Jordan didn't blink. Then tell them they're trespassing, and the next time one of their trucks crosses my property line, I won't be calling the sheriff. I'll be filing a criminal claim and putting a lien on every vehicle that touches my pavement. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The message was received. He stood and left without shaking her hand. But as he drove away, a knot formed in his stomach. Karen hadn't threatened him outright, but she didn't need to. The implication was clear. They weren't going to stop. They would wear him down, grind away at his defenses until he either gave up or was forced into court long enough for their project to finish. This wasn't just about a road. It was about control. And they were betting on him being too stubborn, too isolated, or too broke to fight back. They were wrong. By the end of that week, Jordan Wells understood one truth with perfect clarity. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors, and it wasn't a mistake in zoning or a misunderstanding between legal departments. This was a siege, slow and bureaucratic, meant to push him into compliance not through force but by attrition, noise, frustration, and paperwork. It wasn't the kind of conflict that came with shouts over fences or arguments on doorsteps. It was far colder, more tactical. The road was only the first move. The morning after his meeting with Karen Milhouse, Jordan returned to his property to find that the western drainage trench running parallel to his road had been filled with rubble, chunks of broken concrete, twisted rebar, and what looked like the remnants of a demolished retaining wall. The debris hadn't just been dumped there randomly. It had been layered, packed in a way that obstructed the flow of rainwater. Jordan stepped down into the muddy grass and could already see the pooling beginning to form. The trench had been intentionally sabotaged. His phone buzzed, a text from his construction supervisor. County inspector just showed up. Says we're being cited for unauthorized grade changes and erosion risk. Wants to speak with you. Jordan didn't respond immediately. He stared at the blocked trench, the slow trickle of water already redirecting itself toward the road. Then he turned and walked to the edge of the gate, where the security camera tower stood tall above the tree line. The footage was already uploading to the cloud, and he knew what he'd find. Trucks again. This time likely subcontractors, quietly dropping material under cover of early morning fog. No lights, no noise. Just another surgical incision into his property's integrity. When he met the inspector an hour later, the man was standing with a clipboard, a tired-looking windbreaker, and a forced neutrality that barely masked his discomfort. This complaint wasn't generated by our office, he said, gesturing toward the area Jordan had already cleared. We received a call from the Neighborhood Coalition citing improper grading and risk of downstream water impact. I'm here because I have to be. It's not the grading that's the problem, Jordan said, keeping his voice even. It's the sabotage. That trench was clear 2 days ago. Someone dumped demolition waste overnight. I have footage. The inspector gave a slow nod but didn't ask to see it. Look, he said, dropping his voice slightly. If this turns into a legal matter, I'm just supposed to log the conditions. I'm not enforcement. But if I were you, I'd get ahead of this, clean it up fast, document everything, and file a counterclaim. Already started, Jordan said. And it was true. His attorney had begun filing not only claims of property interference but also a formal request to the county to audit all construction permits submitted by the Neighborhood Development Board over the past 6 months. What had once been a quiet business expansion was now morphing into a war of filings, technicalities, and slow-burn retaliation. 2 days later, the power line running to the road's security system was severed. Not neatly, not surgically. Whoever had done it had used bolt cutters, leaving a frayed end of the line half buried in mud where it had been dragged through the underbrush and thrown behind a cedar stump. The main camera at the southern gate went offline just before midnight, and the motion sensors recorded only one figure, a silhouette in a reflective vest, moving with a deliberate gait, face hidden under a hood. It was the second time his infrastructure had been breached. The repair cost was steep, but Jordan didn't hesitate. He had backup batteries brought in, with a secondary relay line buried under crushed gravel, harder to access, impossible to spot unless someone was actively trying to find it. The pattern had become predictable. Damage, then an accusation. Interference, then a complaint. The morning after the line was cut, a notice was taped to his gate, unsigned, unsealed, just flapping in the wind. Notice of noise violation, Section 4B Community Standards. Jordan stared at it, then laughed quietly to himself. There had been no activity on his site that night. No testing, no generators, nothing beyond the whisper of wind through trees and the hum of a few security lights. The notice was meaningless. It was meant only to irritate him, to chip away at his patience. Karen wasn't just trying to steal access. She was trying to erode his will to fight. And Jordan knew that kind of strategy all too well. He had spent years dealing with corporate back channels, dealing with licensing disputes and industrial sabotage on a financial level. He recognized the markers, the way language was bent to suit objectives, the way silence could be as aggressive as confrontation. He wasn't going to play defense anymore. That weekend, he held a meeting of his own. Not a public one. No signs, no speeches, just 6 people gathered at his office, his attorney, a surveyor, a commercial real estate advisor, his head of operations, a retired land use consultant, and a subcontracted logistics foreman who specialized in route control. They spent 4 hours mapping every square foot of the property and surrounding buffer zones, comparing existing records with recent county filings, tracking discrepancies in property lines, and identifying the exact section where the development board had cut through the original fence. The conclusion was precise and damning. The access point from the residential development, installed without notice or permit, cut across a 3-meter strip of land that had been mistakenly zoned as undesignated in a previous land conversion audit. That was the weak spot. That was the legal foothold Karen had likely used to justify their intrusion. Not a real claim, but a sliver of ambiguity, twisted into leverage. Jordan didn't wait. He ordered the immediate installation of a load-bearing concrete wall along that boundary, 12 feet high, reinforced with a reflective surface on the residential-facing side. It wasn't decorative. It was intentional. On the morning it was poured, several neighbors appeared at the edge of the woods, phones in hand, some shouting, others filming. Karen showed up 2 hours later with a clipboard and 2 men in polo shirts and slacks. Jordan met them at the edge of the wall, not offering to shake hands this time. "This is obstruction of shared access," she said, visibly flushed, sweat beading at her temples. "You're disrupting community transportation plans." "This is reinforcement of a private boundary," Jordan replied, "and you're disrupting nothing that belongs to you." Karen turned to one of her companions, whispering something too low to hear. One of them stepped forward, presenting what he called a courtesy request from the board. It was a stack of printed emails, legal-sounding memos with internal letterheads, none of them binding. Jordan didn't even look at them. He pointed toward the fresh concrete, steam still rising from its surface. "You've got no right of entry, no easement, no documented access agreement. If I see another wheel cross this boundary, you'll be hearing from my litigation counsel." "This isn't over," Karen said, her voice shrill and cutting. "It never was," Jordan said. That night, the local paper ran a small column under its Community Pulse section. Industrial property owner escalates dispute with residential development. Alleged wall creates uproar. Jordan read it with a cup of coffee in hand, unsurprised. The article didn't name him, didn't accuse directly, but the language was tilted. Phrases like reported aggression and isolated construction painted the picture Karen wanted. He clipped the article, filed it with his other documentation, and wrote one line on the folder's cover. "They want pressure. Give them concrete." The next move wouldn't come from Karen. He was already 2 steps ahead. For the next 2 weeks, there was silence, strategic, deliberate, and suspicious. No trucks approached the road. No more debris appeared in his ditches. No new complaints were filed, and even the usual passive-aggressive notes stopped arriving. Jordan found the calm eerie rather than comforting. He knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her didn't abandon their objectives. They simply recalculated, stepped back to sharpen the next move. He spent the time tightening his legal perimeter, reinforcing the narrative of violation with professional assessments, compiling not just raw footage and photos, but affidavits, timestamps, drone images, and a full written chronology of every incident since the first vehicle touched his asphalt. His lawyer, a woman named Elise Hart, who had the voice of a piano wire about to snap, went into overdrive. She filed a complaint not only against the board Karen represented, but also a personal claim against her as a private actor operating outside the limits of any recognized municipal or corporate authority. The suit was narrow in scope: trespass, malicious misrepresentation, property damage, but it was written to draw blood. And Elise knew where to cut. It wasn't just about leverage. Jordan needed a formal precedent on record. If he won in court, even just a partial win, it would become a matter of public legal history, which would block any future attempts to reframe the situation as a communal misunderstanding. No more ambiguity. No more maneuvering through soft language and implied consensus. He wanted ink on paper, authority acknowledged, territory affirmed. But what happened next wasn't legal. It was logistical. A week after the suit was filed, deliveries to Jordan's site began arriving late. Not once or twice, not by accident. It became a pattern. Suppliers who had been dependable for years started reporting sudden detours, unexplained rerouting, and odd instructions to hold deliveries until verification. Some shipments were returned to depot without explanation. Others simply disappeared into limbo. Drivers claiming they had reached a blocked entrance, even when Jordan's gates were wide open, staffed, and operational. Calls to dispatch were met with shrugs. "We just follow the orders that come through the system." Jordan's operations manager flagged the issue quickly. A quiet digital trail suggested someone had altered the delivery routing profiles for multiple vendors. The redirection wasn't official, but it looked like it had originated from an administrative shell, possibly a subcontracted dispatch firm that Karen's people had indirect ties to. Nothing that could be proven in one move, but enough to stall supplies, delay projects, frustrate clients, and raise questions about Jordan's reliability. That was the real attack. It wasn't about road access anymore. It was about his reputation. And reputation, Jordan knew, was currency. Lose it, and everything else bled out after. He responded with precision. He pulled all deliveries in-house for 2 weeks, renting a private flatbed fleet, absorbing the cost himself. He contacted every supplier directly, bypassing third-party logistics, and established a temporary, encrypted ordering channel that couldn't be rerouted without a key. He didn't tell clients about the disruption. He just solved it, fast and invisibly. But behind the scenes, Elise filed an injunction to investigate administrative interference with commercial freight, civil sabotage, technically complex but with teeth sharp enough to bite if tied to a coordinated party. That's when the leak happened. It wasn't an email or a document. it was a voice. An anonymous message arrived at Elise's office. The voice was filtered, genderless, robotic, but clear. It identified itself only as someone tired of watching rules be rewritten for the rich. The message outlined a network of contractual overlaps. Dummy corporations used to manage construction traffic, permits filed through a shell contractor based out of a neighboring county, and, most damningly, an internal memo sent from Karen's board to their legal counsel suggesting a plan to incorporate private infrastructure into public utility schema by default usage over time. Elise listened to the message twice, then once more with Jordan present. Every detail matched the patterns they'd been piecing together. And yet, it wasn't enough. The memo was described, not provided. The companies could be real or fabricated. The voice could belong to anyone, from an inside source to an opportunistic activist. Legally, it was smoke, no fire. But Jordan didn't need to prove everything at once. He just needed one match. So he changed the strategy. He pulled back his legal offensive, paused filings, went silent publicly, and then, under the radar, he made his move, not in court, not in public view, but in the real arena, the land itself. Through Elise's contact at the planning office, Jordan discovered that the access gate the development had cut into their fence was built just inches beyond their permitted zone, by less than a foot, technically on his land. That mistake meant the entire point of entry was a structural violation. He didn't demolish it. That would have played into their hands. Instead, he registered the gate as unpermitted construction subject to audit. That triggered an automatic compliance review, forcing the neighborhood board to either defend its legality or remove it. No court, no press, just paperwork with deadlines. Within days, engineers showed up at the fence line, confused, frustrated, caught off guard. Their tools stayed in their trucks. The gate was closed, locked, and with no documentation to defend its placement, it remained that way indefinitely. The construction flow collapsed. Karen had counted on habit. Jordan had broken it. But what truly shifted the ground was a phone call. Late one evening, Elise forwarded a message from a contact in the county auditor's office. It was short, almost casual, but carried weight. Your client's road was referenced in a recent review by the board. There was discussion, informal, off the record, about requesting emergency jurisdiction due to critical access needs. You didn't hear it from me, but they're getting desperate. Jordan sat alone in his office for hours after that, not moving, barely breathing. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was a signal. They'd tried to use his land. They'd tried to poison his operations. Now they were angling to make it public domain under emergency provision. That wasn't just trespass. That was theft under color of law. And the next time they came for his road, he'd be ready. Not with concrete or cameras, but with the kind of retaliation that left permanent damage. The illusion of containment shattered on a Tuesday morning, just before dawn, when Jordan's phone buzzed with 3 separate alerts: motion detection at the northern gate, a power anomaly at the control box, and an audio spike on the long-range mic. So steam? He sat up in bed immediately, heart already racing with the preemptive sense that something was off. Within seconds, he accessed the live feeds, switching between angles, adjusting gain and brightness until the picture stabilized. 4 men in reflective vests and neutral-colored workwear were dismantling the electronic gate system with practiced efficiency. One was using a portable grinder on the steel latch while another held up a clipboard and gestured calmly to the camera as if this were a prearranged, authorized service operation. It wasn't. Jordan hadn't filed any requests. No work order had been placed, and these men had arrived in a vehicle with no plates and blacked-out logos. He called the security firm first, who dispatched a mobile unit immediately. Then he called the sheriff's office and reported the act not as trespass this time, but as tampering with a secured access system and potential theft of private infrastructure. By the time he arrived on site 20 minutes later, the gate was hanging open, the ground littered with disconnected wiring, bolt fragments, and a crushed junction box. The men were gone, leaving behind only a laminated note zip-tied to the gate post that read, "Access granted per Emergency Use Clause, Section 7, Revision A." There was no such clause in the county's infrastructure code, but the note bore a seal, circular metallic ink with the words Community Development Authority printed around the edge. It looked official. It looked deliberate. Jordan didn't speak as the deputy took his statement, didn't argue when told it might take a few days to investigate, and didn't explain that Section 7 Revision A was a document that hadn't existed on any zoning agenda for over a decade. He simply documented everything, scanned the note, collected the debris into evidence bags, and returned to his office with the expression of a man whose patience had been surgically removed. He didn't waste time contacting Elise this time. She was already waiting on the line. "They're testing your threshold," she said immediately, "seeing how far they can go before you escalate legally. But this wasn't quiet sabotage. This was public. They're trying to flip the optics." That same day, 2 county council members received letters from Elise's office, notices of formal legal review tied to potential misuse of zoning protocol and the impersonation of official authorization materials. It wasn't an accusation. Not yet. But it was a shot across the bow. Within 48 hours, one of them responded, carefully worded, suggesting that the seal used in the laminated notice did not originate from any recognized county body. They couldn't confirm who had issued it, but it may have been improperly adopted by a private development group. That phrasing, improperly adopted, was enough to begin filing preliminary motions to trigger a full administrative audit of the board's activity. But Jordan wasn't finished. He brought in 2 independent appraisers and a forensic infrastructure consultant, a former military-grade systems engineer who specialized in breach reconstruction. They walked the property in slow silence, tracing every cable run, every sensor lead, every point of ingress. What they found was staggering. Multiple buried power lines along the perimeter had been spliced, surgical cuts made with insulated blades, then recovered with precisely packed soil to avoid detection. Fiber lines feeding Jordan's remote monitoring server had been tapped with micro-optic relays buried inside irrigation junctions. The consultant turned to Jordan after the final sweep and said, "This wasn't vandalism. This was deliberate counter-surveillance." It was the moment Jordan realized the fight had crossed into another arena. This wasn't just about his road anymore. This was about leverage. Whoever was directing these actions wasn't simply trying to gain access. They were trying to discredit his control over it, degrade his infrastructure until the narrative could shift from owner under siege to owner incapable of maintenance. If they could make him look negligent, they could justify intervention. Not through litigation, but through narrative. And then came the fire. It wasn't large, it didn't reach any structures, but it was placed with horrifying precision. At the southern end of the property, in the dry clearing beyond the second loading bay, a pile of discarded insulation and broken pallets had ignited at 3:12 a.m., according to the infrared logs. The camera feed cut out 2 minutes before the flare. When the footage was recovered from a backup relay, the image was grainy, corrupted, but showed one figure again in reflective gear, carrying a red gas can and moving with no urgency at all. The fire was extinguished by Jordan's own emergency system, a sprinkler grid he'd installed for insurance compliance, but the footage made its way to Elise, and from Elise to an investigative liaison at the state's Property Crime Division. It still wasn't arson, not legally, because no structure was damaged, but it was now part of an accumulating stack of evidence, each sheet heavier than the last. Jordan remained silent in public. He didn't contact press, didn't post on forums, didn't participate in rumors, but his actions intensified. He commissioned a full structural audit of the development's newly installed utilities, because one portion of their drainage system now intersected the buffer zone adjacent to his retention basin. He filed a motion to review their environmental compliance records, highlighting the chemical residues left behind after their trucks passed through during the rainy season. He initiated a private third-party investigation into the shell companies leasing the construction equipment. The names traced back to a holding group registered in another state, Delaware, of course, and from there, no further records emerged. But one name did come up. Not Karen. Beneath the legal filings, beneath the leasing agreements, the recurring signature on every equipment authorization was a man named Thomas Riving. He wasn't a board member, not officially, but he was listed as a development consultant on a dozen projects across the state, all of which had coincided with sudden infrastructure conflicts, zoning complaints, and escalated legal fights with private landowners. Elise called it a ghost chain. One individual with no official seat, but absolute operational influence. Jordan didn't know him, had never seen him, but now he understood. Karen wasn't the strategist. She was the mouthpiece. The real engine behind the intrusion was corporate. Quiet, funded, organized, and Jordan, by holding that road, by resisting, by refusing to be worn down, had become an obstruction in someone's million-dollar pathway. So he retaliated with the only weapon Karen, Thomas, and their network wouldn't expect: withdrawal. Not from the fight, but from public view. He shut down deliveries to the southern edge, moved operations to the north route entirely, cut visibility, removed external signage. He reclassified the zone adjacent to the road as sensitive equipment staging and registered the site under a temporary protected research exemption, forcing any inspections to file 48-hour notices. He built a new gate, one without cameras, one without electronic triggers, and behind it he had a trench cut, 6 feet deep, lined with rebar, filled with nothing but air and silence. They wanted him visible. He became invisible. They wanted conflict. He gave them stillness. And in that silence, Jordan prepared something else entirely, something that didn't involve gates or gravel or fireproof walls. He began building a case for injunction not just against the board or Karen or the construction firm, but against the financial arm behind them all. He wasn't going to block trucks anymore. He was going to block funding. By the time Jordan's case for injunction was complete, the documents filled 2 full boxes: legal briefs, forensic reports, surveyor records, internal memos obtained through subpoena, chain of custody logs for tampered equipment, and a detailed financial map connecting the front-facing construction firm to a privately held investment fund operating under the name Ridgeway Capital Holdings. It was Ridgeway, not Karen, not the neighborhood board, that had quietly leased the trucks, routed the concrete pours, filed development blueprints under ghost contractors, and pushed to create the illusion of public access through Jordan's Road. Ridgeway had remained invisible by design, cloaking its actions through layers of subcontracting and proxy filings, but once Elise exposed the central operating entity behind the construction group, the rest followed like a slow collapse of scaffolding. Karen's role, while petty and aggressive, was merely surface level. She'd been installed not to build policy, but to absorb resistance. She was the stone they threw so no one would notice the hand behind it. Jordan knew the game had reached its end phase when the first formal letter arrived not from a board, but from Ridgeway's legal team, a firm from out of state, crisp, expensive, the kind that didn't make spelling errors or rhetorical flourishes. The letter proposed a settlement. The language was immaculate, but the message was clear. They offered to purchase a perpetual easement through Jordan's Road in exchange for a one-time payout. The number was high, 7 figures, enough to make most men consider options, but Jordan didn't even blink. He didn't want their money. He wanted precedent. He declined. And that's when the gloves came off. 2 days after the refusal, a city maintenance crew appeared at the edge of the road, claiming they'd been instructed to inspect a possible gas leak under private infrastructure. They had no permits, no explanation, and when asked who sent them, one man shrugged and said, "Dispatch." Jordan filmed everything, called the sheriff's department, and filed a restraining order against unauthorized utility interference. It wasn't about gas. It was about staging. If they could get a public worker on his road, even under a false premise, they could later cite the moment as proof that the road had served public use. That night, someone cut the lighting system again, this time with a low-voltage disruptor hidden inside the exterior control panel, designed to fry the internal surge protections without tripping the mains. Jordan responded by installing battery-operated perimeter lights and pulled all power cabling into steel-jacketed conduit, buried 3 feet deeper than code required. They wouldn't get another chance. But they tried anyway. A week later, a new access gate appeared on the far side of the development. Small, unassuming, but positioned in a way that, through a recent parcel merge, now connected Ridgeway's project directly to a public alley that hadn't existed 2 years earlier. The implication was clear. They were rerouting, pivoting to an alternate plan. Jordan should have felt relief. Instead, he felt fury. They were going to walk away. Not defeated, not exposed, just rerouted. As if the last 3 months had been a minor setback on a spreadsheet. As if the road they tried to steal, the surveillance systems they destroyed, the fire they lit, none of it mattered. But Jordan didn't want them to walk away. He wanted the ledger opened, so he made one final move. Using the evidence Elise had gathered, Jordan filed a motion for injunctive relief with attached claims of pattern interference, intentional sabotage, and commercial obstruction, naming not only Ridgeway Capital but also their board of directors, their controlling firm, and their project's registered compliance officer. The judge reviewed the motion personally and, for the first time, issued a full temporary injunction pending full review, a legal freeze on all Ridgeway development tied to that parcel cluster. Every truck stopped. Every blueprint was shelved. Every dollar tied to their site development went into immediate escrow. Ridgeway's response came fast, clinical, and with polished hostility. Their lawyers filed a countersuit, accusing Jordan of malicious obstruction, bad faith negotiation, and interference with regional economic growth. But the difference this time was that Jordan wasn't responding from behind a broken gate or a fire-damaged yard. He was in the courtroom, on record, and this time, it was their infrastructure being questioned, their permits under audit, their documents being pulled by state-level regulatory bodies who didn't care about Ridgeway's image or Karen's noise. Karen herself didn't appear at the first hearing, but her name was referenced in testimony. Twice. Once as the signer of a knowingly false memo regarding gate authorization, and again in connection to the forged emergency access clause that had been zip-tied to Jordan's fence post weeks prior. Elise requested an ethics referral. The judge granted it. It was a slow grind. The wheels of litigation didn't spin fast, but they spun. And when Ridgeway's attorney offered a new settlement, a higher number with a signed apology from the board and a legally documented withdrawal of all claims to the road, Jordan paused. Not because the money tempted him, but because this time the offer came with the one thing he actually wanted: admission of boundary breach and full public acknowledgement of his sole ownership. Elise reviewed the language, revised 4 sections, and then handed him the final version. He didn't sign it immediately. He made them wait. 3 days. Long enough to let Ridgeway's financiers squirm. Long enough to let the county see the headlines. When he did sign, it was with one condition written in his own hand at the bottom of the document. No access granted, no future appeal permitted, all rights reserved. He had shut it down. Not with fences, not with threats, but with paper, precedent, and patience. On the evening the last truck left the development's staging area, Jordan stood on his road, staring down the length of asphalt that had become the unlikely battlefield of modern territorial warfare. There were no crowds, no cameras, just quiet, cold air and the soft hum of lights flickering back on along the gravel shoulder. A small piece of laminated plastic still hung from the post where the fake notice had once been zip-tied. Jordan pulled it down and tossed it into the brush. Victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like restoration, like something broken had been quietly rebuilt while no one was watching. They would never drive through here again. The quiet that followed Ridgway's withdrawal wasn't celebratory. It was dense, subdued, the kind of silence that settles only after a long siege. Not because peace has been achieved, but because all ammunition has finally been spent. Jordan Wells didn't host a victory dinner. He didn't give interviews or publish op-eds or schedule any speaking engagements to educate other landowners on how to fight corporate encroachment. He didn't need to. The silence was the statement. The road stood undisturbed, sealed by precedent and notarized finality, and for the first time in nearly a year, there were no tire tracks that didn't belong to him. The wall remained, 12 feet of concrete, rebar reinforced, still casting its long shadow over the edge of the residential development like a forgotten monument. No one tried to paint over it. No one posted signs or protested its presence. It had become, over time, something more than a structure. It was a memory carved into the landscape, a reminder to everyone who passed it that some fights couldn't be won with noise or policy or false unity. Some boundaries could not be softened. They had to be carved, held, and protected with precision. Karen was not seen again. The neighborhood newsletter, which had once casually listed her name at the bottom of every community event flyer, now carried only vague references to a transition in leadership and structural realignment of planning personnel. Jordan didn't. Kare. He had never wanted her to suffer, had never rooted for her public collapse. All he wanted was space. Space to build, to own, to exist without manipulation. She had chosen the conflict, had underestimated his resolve, and now she had vanished into the very bureaucracy she'd once weaponized. The Ridgway development eventually resumed, but not near his land. A new access point was built through a rezoned parcel several blocks away, purchased at a much higher cost from a commercial entity that had no interest in fighting. The irony wasn't lost on Jordan. Ridgway had burned hundreds of thousands of dollars attempting to override a privately owned road, only to end up paying more for a less efficient route. But it was never about efficiency. It was about convenience dressed as inevitability, about power disguised as urban planning. And that was where they had miscalculated. They assumed resistance meant negotiation. They didn't expect a man to simply say no and mean it. Jordan's business thrived quietly in the aftermath. Freed from interference, he expanded the test range, built a secondary structure for long-range acoustic simulations, and eventually opened a consultation wing for government contractors needing secure infrastructure analysis. The road remained closed to outsiders, legally and physically. The gate, once a symbol of stress and retaliation, was now routine, opened in the morning, closed before dusk, protected not by cameras or alarms, but by clarity. There were no gray areas left. Everything had been proven. Everything had been written. Nothing remained to question. Occasionally, he would receive inquiries from other property owners, quiet messages forwarded through Elise or routed by industry contacts. People who had seen pieces of his battle through legal bulletins or whispered corporate channels. Some asked for advice. Some wanted referrals. He responded to few, not out of arrogance, but caution. Not every fight could be won the way his had. His victory hadn't been cinematic. It had been surgical, slow, and rooted in discipline more than anger. It wasn't the kind of story that fit neatly into a motivational package. But once, just once, a letter arrived that he didn't throw away. Handwritten, sealed in a plain white envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sentence written in clean cursive. You reminded the rest of us that land still means something. There was no signature, but Jordan kept the letter. Not framed, just tucked inside the drawer of his desk, folded neatly beside the deed to the road. On the 1-year anniversary of the first gate being cut, he walked the length of the road in silence. No headphones, no phone, just the steady rhythm of boots on asphalt and the wind moving through the pine. Halfway down, he stopped, stared at the stretch of pavement that had once carried more conflict than concrete, and simply stood there for a while, letting the air settle around him. The world had kept moving, but here, in this place, he had made it stop. He turned, walked back, and shut the gate behind him. And for the first time in a long while, it stayed closed.